What happened to you in high school that completely destroyed your faith in authority? Mine started with a lunch period that turned into the worst 48 hours of my life, all while my diabetic younger brother was home alone with no insulin. I was sitting in the cafeteria at Jefferson High in Portland, Oregon, eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and working on chemistry homework when the lockdown alarm started blaring at exactly 12:34 p.m. At first, we all thought it was another drill. Mrs. Patterson, the lunch monitor, started herding everyone toward the storage room behind the kitchen like always. The drill routine was so familiar that half the kids were still talking and laughing, some even complaining about having to leave their food behind. But then Principal Williams burst through the double doors with 3 police officers, and his face was chalk white. His usual authoritative composure was completely gone, replaced by visible panic. Behind him, Officer Rodriguez, Officer Kim, and Detective Sarah Miller moved with the kind of urgency that immediately told us this wasn't practice. "This is not a drill," Williams announced over the handheld intercom, his voice shaking slightly. "We have received a credible bomb threat with specific details about our building. All students report to designated safe areas immediately. Teachers, implement lockdown protocol level red." My stomach dropped, but not for the reason you think. It was 12:30 p.m., and my little brother Marcus would be getting home from Lincoln Middle School in exactly 2 hours. Mom was working a double shift at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital and wouldn't be back until midnight. Marcus was only 12 and had type 1 diabetes since he was 7. His afternoon insulin shot was scheduled for exactly 3 p.m. sharp. No exceptions. If he missed it by even an hour, his blood sugar would spike dangerously high, potentially into the 300s or 400s. We got packed into the storage room with about 60 other kids from the lunch period. The space was cramped, hot, and smelled like industrial cleaning supplies, mixed with the lingering odor of cafeteria food. The concrete walls were lined with metal shelving units filled with bulk supplies, and the single overhead fluorescent light flickered intermittently. Officer Rodriguez positioned himself by the door while Mrs. Patterson tried to keep everyone calm, repeatedly telling us to sit quietly against the walls. I immediately pulled out my phone to call Marcus, but there was no signal. The thick concrete walls of the storage area blocked everything. No bars, no data, nothing. I tried moving to different corners of the room, holding my phone up high, even asking if I could step outside for just 1 minute to make a call. "I need to call my brother," I told Mrs. Patterson urgently. "He's diabetic and needs his medication in less than 2 hours. She looked sympathetic, but shook her head firmly. "Nobody leaves until the building is cleared by the bomb squad. Medical emergencies will be handled by paramedics once they arrive." "He's not here," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady despite the panic building in my chest. "He's at home. He needs his insulin injection at 3 p.m. exactly, or he could go into diabetic ketoacidosis. That's when the blood becomes acidic from high blood sugar. It can kill him." Officer Rodriguez overheard our conversation and walked over, his heavy boots echoing in the concrete space. "What's your brother's name, age, and address?" I gave him all the information, speaking quickly. "Marcus Thompson, 12 years old, 1247 Cedar Street, apartment 3B. He has type 1 diabetes and takes 8 units of Humalog insulin every day at 3 p.m. He's home alone and doesn't have a key to get to neighbors. The insulin is in the refrigerator door, blue pen injector." Rodriguez nodded and pulled out his radio. "I'll get dispatched to send a patrol car for a welfare check. They can administer the medication if needed." That gave me some relief, but I still couldn't shake the growing worry. Marcus was probably getting off the bus right now, walking the 3 blocks home alone like every day. He'd unlock the apartment, grab a snack, and start his homework at the kitchen table. But at 3 p.m., when I wasn't there to remind him and help with the injection, would he remember on his own? 30 minutes passed. The bomb squad had arrived in their massive truck that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Through the small window in the storage room door, we could occasionally see officers in full protective gear moving through the hallways with equipment and German shepherds trained to detect explosives. Every few minutes, we'd hear their heavy boots overhead, along with the occasional sharp bark of the bomb-sniffing dogs and the static crackle of radio communications. My anxiety was through the roof because it was now 1:30 p.m., and I still hadn't heard anything about Marcus. The welfare check should have been simple. Send an officer to knock on the door, explain the situation, maybe wait with Marcus until 3 p.m. to help with the injection. "Did anyone check on my brother?" I asked Officer Rodriguez for the 3rd time, trying not to sound too demanding. He looked annoyed, his jaw tightening. "Dispatch is handling it. We're dealing with a potential terrorist threat here. Your brother isn't our priority right now. We've got bigger problems than one kid's medication schedule." That's when I started to panic. Marcus was probably home alone right now, sitting at the kitchen table, working on math homework, completely unaware that I was trapped at school. He was probably wondering why I hadn't texted him like usual to confirm he got home safely. His blood sugar was already starting to climb from missing his morning snack, and if it got too high, he'd become confused, lethargic, and eventually unconscious. I'd seen it happen once before when we miscalculated his dosage after a birthday party. He'd gone from normal to slurring his words to barely conscious in less than 2 hours. That time, we caught it early and got him to the emergency room. This time, he was completely alone. At 2:15 p.m., they finally let us move from the storage room to the main gymnasium while they finished clearing the kitchen and cafeteria areas. The gym was slightly better. More space, better lighting, and crucially, some students were getting weak cell signals near the windows on the east side. I immediately ran to that area and tried my phone again. 1 bar, then 2 bars, then back to nothing. The few calls that did manage to connect kept dropping after a few seconds. The local cell towers were completely overwhelmed with everyone trying to call their families simultaneously. I found my friend Jake Martinez in the crowd and quickly explained the situation. Jake had been my lab partner in chemistry all semester and knew about Marcus's condition because I'd mentioned having to leave early sometimes for his doctor appointments. "Dude, that's insane," Jake said. "They have to let you call him or at least send someone to check." Jake volunteered to help me sneak out through the locker room exit to get to Marcus. But when we tried to move in that direction, we discovered that every single exit was blocked by police officers or school security. They weren't just discouraging people from leaving, they were physically preventing it. Officer Kim stood at the main gym entrance, arms crossed, turning away any student who approached. "This is insane," I told Mrs. Patterson when she walked by doing a head count. "My brother could die while we're sitting here for what might be a fake bomb threat." Her expression softened, and she stopped to really listen for the first time. "Honey, I understand you're worried, but we don't know it's fake. The person who called it in knew specific details about our building layout, mentioned the boiler room, the chemistry lab storage, even the principal's office location. The FBI is taking it very seriously." "But my brother," I started. "I know," she interrupted gently. "Look, let me talk to Principal Williams personally. Maybe we can get someone to check on Marcus without compromising the lockdown." By 2:45 p.m., I was getting truly desperate. Marcus should have had his insulin in just 15 minutes. Mrs. Patterson had disappeared to talk to the principal 15 minutes ago and hadn't returned. I approached Principal Williams directly where he stood near the scorer's table, surrounded by papers and radio equipment. "Mr. Williams," I said, trying to sound respectful despite my panic. "I spoke with Officer Rodriguez hours ago about my brother's medical emergency. He said he'd radio for a welfare check, but I haven't heard anything back. Can you please confirm that someone went to check on Marcus?" Williams barely looked up from his clipboard full of student names and emergency protocols. "I don't see any record of a welfare check being requested for your address," he said dismissively. My heart sank. "Officer Rodriguez said he'd radio it in hours ago. My brother needs insulin at 3 p.m. or he could go into diabetic ketoacidosis." Williams called Rodriguez over with an impatient wave. "Rodriguez, this student says you were supposed to request a welfare check?" Rodriguez just shrugged, not even looking embarrassed about forgetting. "Must have gotten lost in all the chaos. Dispatch was swamped with calls about the bomb threat. We had other priorities." That's when I realized they'd never even tried to help Marcus. They just told me what I wanted to hear to keep me quiet and compliant. My 12-year-old diabetic brother had been home alone for over 2 hours, and it was now 2:50 p.m. He needed his insulin in 10 minutes, and nobody in authority had even made the phone call they'd promised. I completely lost it. The careful politeness I'd been maintaining evaporated instantly. "Are you kidding me?" I shouted, loud enough that other students turned to stare. "You told me you'd send someone. My brother is diabetic. He could die if his blood sugar gets too high." Principal Williams's face flushed red with anger. "Lower your voice immediately, or you'll be suspended for disrupting emergency procedures." "Disrupting?" I screamed, beyond caring about consequences now. "My brother could be in a coma right now because you people are incompetent. He's 12 years old and diabetic, and you lied to me about getting help." Several other students had gathered around us now, including Jake and my friend Emma Chen from AP History. Emma was student council president and generally respected by the faculty. She stepped forward to support me. "Mr. Williams," Emma said diplomatically, "couldn't someone just call the house to check? It would take 2 minutes." But Williams was done listening. That's when they decided I was the problem instead of trying to solve the actual problem. Officer Rodriguez grabbed my arm firmly and marched me away from the group toward a separate classroom. "You're coming with me until you can control yourself," Rodriguez said, gripping my upper arm tighter than necessary. They put me in an empty chemistry classroom and locked the door from the outside. I could hear the click of the deadbolt engaging. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being held in the same type of classroom where I'd been learning about chemical reactions while my brother faced a potentially deadly biological reaction from lack of insulin. I pounded on that heavy wooden door for 20 minutes straight, my fists getting sore from hitting the solid wood. I begged anyone who walked by in the hallway to please just call my house or send someone to check on Marcus. Several teachers stopped to listen through the door, including Mr. Rodriguez from English and Miss Park, who taught biology. Please, I called out to Miss Park specifically. You teach biology. You know what diabetic ketoacidosis is. My brother is 12 and alone. It's past 3 p.m. now. Miss Park's voice came through the door, sounding genuinely concerned. I understand, but I can't override emergency protocols. The principal has to authorize any outside contact during lockdown. Then get the principal, I yelled back. Tell him a kid might die. But nobody had that authority, or nobody wanted to take responsibility for making an exception. They all said the same thing. They couldn't override emergency protocols. The system was more important than one diabetic child. At 3:15 p.m., I stopped pounding on the door and slumped against it, crying for the first time. Marcus's injection was 15 minutes late. His blood sugar was climbing into dangerous territory with every passing minute. Type 1 diabetics can't survive without insulin. Their bodies simply stop processing sugar properly, and glucose builds up in the bloodstream like poison. At 3:45 p.m., I heard commotion in the hallway. Voices were raised, radios crackling with activity. Then the intercom crackled to life with Principal Williams's voice, though he sounded different now, less panicked, more annoyed. Attention students and staff. The bomb threat has been determined to be a hoax. The building has been cleared by the bomb squad and K-9 units. However, we are not dismissing students at this time due to ongoing investigation protocols. A hoax. All of this, the terror, the lockdown, Marcus missing his insulin, was because some kid somewhere had called in a fake bomb threat. I later learned it was a 16-year-old from a different school district who didn't want to take his calculus final exam. He'd found Jefferson High's address online and made the call from a payphone at a gas station. But they still wouldn't let me leave. I heard footsteps in the hallway and then the click of the door being unlocked. Principal Williams entered with Officer Rodriguez and Mrs. Martinez, the school counselor I'd never met before. We need to discuss your behavior during the emergency, Williams said, settling into a student desk that looked comically small under his large frame. Disrupting safety procedures is a serious offense that could have endangered other students. I stared at him in disbelief. It's 4 p.m. My brother needed his insulin an hour ago. Can I please just go home now? Not until we address your conduct, said Mrs. Martinez, opening a leather folder full of disciplinary forms. Your outburst in the gymnasium was witnessed by dozens of students. You were shouting, making threats, creating panic during an active emergency situation. Threats, I said, my voice cracking. I never threatened anyone. I was trying to save my brother's life. Officer Rodriguez consulted his notes. You said, and I quote, I'll sue this district if anything happens to my brother. That constitutes a threat of legal action. Because you weren't helping him, I shouted back. You told me you'd radio for a welfare check and then forgot. A diabetic kid could die because you couldn't make one phone call. William slammed his hand on the student desk, which creaked under the impact. That's exactly the attitude that got you in trouble in the first place. You're suspended for 3 days for insubordination, disrupting emergency procedures, and threatening school personnel. They kept me in that office for another 45 minutes, lecturing me about respecting authority and following protocols while my brother was home alone with blood sugar that had been climbing for nearly 2 hours. They made me sign papers acknowledging the suspension and listen to a speech about how my behavior could have caused a stampede if there had been a real bomb. They finally released me at 4:45 p.m., nearly 2 hours after Marcus should have had his insulin shot. I ran the entire mile home, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine with every step. I'd never run that fast in my life, sprinting through crosswalks and dodging parked cars while my lungs burned from the cold October air. I burst through the front door of our apartment, fumbling with keys and calling Marcus's name. Marcus? Marcus, are you okay? No answer from the living room. I checked the kitchen. Empty. His backpack was on the table next to half-finished math homework, but no Marcus. Marcus? I called again, running down the hallway to his bedroom. I found him collapsed on his bedroom floor next to his desk, conscious but barely responsive. His skin was flushed and hot to the touch, and he was breathing rapidly in shallow gas. His blood sugar monitor was on the floor next to him. He'd apparently tried to check his levels before collapsing. The display read 487 milligrams per deciliter. Normal blood sugar is between 80 to 120. Anything over 400 is considered a medical emergency. Marcus, can you hear me? I said, kneeling beside him and checking his pulse. It was rapid and weak. He opened his eyes slightly and tried to say my name, but it came out as incomprehensible mumbling. Classic signs of severe hyperglycemia: confusion, dehydration, rapid breathing as his body tried to eliminate excess acid through his lungs. I immediately gave him his emergency glucagon injection from the kit we kept in his nightstand drawer. The glucagon would stimulate his liver to release stored glucose, which seemed counterintuitive, but it also triggers the release of insulin from any functioning pancreatic cells and can help stabilize severe blood sugar swings. Then I called 911. 911, what's your emergency? My brother is diabetic and in ketoacidosis. He's 12 years old. Blood sugar is 487. He's semi-conscious and breathing rapidly. I just gave him glucagon. We're dispatching paramedics to your location. Stay with him and monitor his breathing. Don't give him anything to drink. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours. EMT Sarah Wilson and her partner Mike took one look at Marcus and immediately started an IV to begin fluid replacement and insulin therapy. They confirmed what I already knew. He was in diabetic ketoacidosis, a potentially fatal condition where the blood becomes acidic from lack of insulin. You did the right thing with the glucagon, Sarah told me as they prepared to transport Marcus. How long has he been without insulin? Almost 3 hours, I said, climbing into the back of the ambulance. I was trapped at school during a bomb threat lockdown. Mike looked up from his equipment with a frown. 3 hours? That's way too long for a type 1 diabetic his age. Schools are supposed to have emergency protocols for this. The ambulance ride to Oregon Health and Science University Hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness while Sarah worked to stabilize his blood sugar with IV insulin and saline solution. His skin was hot and dry from dehydration, and he kept mumbling incoherently about his homework and asking for water. Don't give him anything to drink, Sarah warned me. His stomach is probably delayed from the high blood sugar. He could aspirate. All I could think about was how the school had failed us when we needed help most. A simple phone call could have prevented all of this. One officer taking 2 minutes to radio dispatch could have saved my brother from hours of suffering and potential brain damage from prolonged ketoacidosis. Mom met us at the emergency room, having left work the moment I called her. She was still wearing her hospital scrubs with Jennifer Thompson, RN, embroidered on the pocket. When she heard what happened, her face went through a series of emotions: fear, relief that Marcus was alive, and then pure rage. They did what? She said after I explained about the lockdown and the failed welfare check. They told you they'd send someone and then just forgot. Dr. Martinez, the pediatric endocrinologist on call, emerged from Marcus's room with a serious expression. We've got him stabilized, but he was in severe diabetic ketoacidosis. His blood pH was 7.1, which is dangerously acidic. Normal is 7.4. Another hour without treatment and he could have suffered permanent brain damage or gone into a coma. Mom's hand started shaking. As a nurse, she understood exactly what those numbers meant. How long will he need to stay? At least 48 hours in the pediatric ICU while we correct his blood chemistry gradually. We have to bring his blood sugar down slowly to avoid cerebral edema, brain swelling. His ketone levels are also extremely high. The doctor explained that missing insulin for that long had caused Marcus's body to start breaking down fat for energy since it couldn't use glucose without insulin. This process creates dangerous acids called ketones that make the blood acidic. Left untreated, ketoacidosis causes organs to shut down and can be fatal. He's lucky his brother found him when he did, Dr. Martinez told Mom. The glucagon injection bought us some time, and getting fluids and insulin started immediately probably saved his life. While Marcus was being admitted to the ICU, Mom contacted David Kim, a lawyer who specialized in educational negligence cases. David had handled several high-profile cases against Oregon school districts and had a reputation for holding schools accountable when their policies hurt students. When we met with David the next morning in his downtown Portland office, his face grew increasingly serious as we explained what happened. He took detailed notes about the timeline, the failed welfare check, my suspension, and Marcus's near-fatal condition. The school had a clear duty to help with the medical emergency once you reported it, David said, reviewing his notes. The fact that they lied about calling for a welfare check and then punished you for advocating for your brother shows a pattern of negligence and retaliation. This goes beyond simple incompetence. David explained that schools have a legal obligation to act reasonably when students report genuine emergencies involving family members. While they couldn't be expected to handle every parental request during a lockdown, medical emergencies involving life-threatening conditions like diabetes fell into a different category. The officer promised to radio for a welfare check and then didn't follow through, David continued. That's not just negligence. It's a breach of the duty of care they assumed when they told you they'd handle it. Over the next few days, while Marcus recovered in the hospital, David began building our case. He filed a formal complaint with the school district and started gathering evidence about their lockdown procedures and emergency protocols. The case made local news when Channel 12 picked up the story. Local students suspended after brother's near-fatal emergency, was the headline that ran during the evening news. The story highlighted how schools handle medical emergencies during lockdowns and whether current procedures adequately protect students' family members. The school district's response was predictably defensive. Their spokesperson, Linda Harrison, issued a statement saying they'd followed all proper emergency procedures and that my disruptive behavior had been appropriately disciplined. They argued that during a potential terrorist threat, they couldn't spare resources for non-emergency situations. Non-emergency? Mom said when we watched the news report together in Marcus's hospital room. A diabetic child without insulin is absolutely an emergency. What's wrong with these people? The district's lawyer, Robert Chin, went further in his response to David's complaint. He claimed that lockdown procedures existed to protect the greatest number of students and that making exceptions would compromise the integrity of emergency protocols and potentially endanger other children. This argument infuriated David, who had seen similar cases where schools prioritized rigid rule following over common sense and basic human compassion. Marcus spent 3 full days in the ICU while they gradually corrected his blood chemistry and monitored him for complications. His blood sugar came down slowly from the dangerous 487 to normal levels around 110. His ketones cleared from his system and the acidosis resolved without causing permanent damage. During those hospital days, I barely left his bedside. I helped him with his breathing exercises, read to him when he was feeling better, and listened as he described what had happened at home. I started feeling really thirsty around 3:30, Marcus told me on his second day. Like super thirsty, but also kind of sick to my stomach. I tried to text you to ask about my insulin, but my phone was dead. He'd attempted to give himself the injection around 4 p.m., but by then his blood sugar was so high that he was confused and shaky. He'd managed to check his glucose level and see the alarming 400 plus reading, but then collapsed before he could do anything about it. I kept thinking you'd come home soon, he said quietly. I was trying to stay awake until you got there. The guilt nearly destroyed me. While I'd been sitting in that office getting lectured about my behavior, my little brother had been alone and scared, watching his body shut down from lack of medication. On the 4th day, Dr. Martinez cleared Marcus to go home with strict instructions about monitoring his blood sugar more frequently and having emergency supplies in multiple locations. The hospital also provided us with a continuous glucose monitor that would alert us if his levels went dangerously high again. David had been busy during Marcus's hospitalization. He'd filed formal discovery requests with the school district, demanding all documents related to their lockdown procedures, emergency protocols, and staff training materials. He'd also requested the radio logs from the day of the incident to prove that no welfare check had been requested. The depositions began 3 weeks later. They were held in a sterile conference room at the district's administrative building, with court reporters recording every word. David had prepared me thoroughly for what to expect, but it was still intimidating to sit across from the school officials who had failed us so badly. Principal Williams was the first to testify. Under oath, he claimed he didn't recall being specifically informed about Marcus's medical condition during the lockdown. When David showed him the disciplinary paperwork that explicitly mentioned diabetic brother emergency, Williams said he'd been too focused on the bomb threat to pay attention to individual student issues. So you're saying that when a student reports a life-threatening medical emergency involving their sibling, that's just an individual student issue that doesn't deserve attention during a lockdown? David asked. Williams shifted uncomfortably. We have to prioritize the safety of the 1,200 students in our building over external concerns. External concerns? David repeated. A 12-year-old diabetic child without insulin is an external concern? The lawyer representing the school district kept objecting, claiming David's questions were argumentative, but the depositions revealed a clear pattern of negligence and indifference. Officer Rodriguez was even worse. He testified that he thought someone else was handling the welfare check request, though he couldn't specify who that someone else was supposed to be. When pressed about why he hadn't followed up on such a serious medical emergency, he claimed he'd been too busy with security concerns. Did you understand that type 1 diabetes can be fatal without insulin? David asked. I'm not a doctor, Rodriguez replied. I deal with security issues, not medical issues. But you told the student you would radio for a welfare check. Did you do that? Long pause. I may have forgotten in all the chaos. Mrs. Patterson was more sympathetic in her testimony, but ultimately just as unhelpful. She confirmed that I'd been respectful and calm when initially asking for help, and only became upset after hours of being ignored. But she also said she wasn't qualified to evaluate medical emergencies and had to defer to the principal and police officers. The most damaging testimony came from Mrs. Martinez, the school counselor who'd helped process my suspension. Under oath, she admitted that she'd never received any training on handling medical emergencies during lockdowns. She'd simply followed the standard disciplinary procedures for disruptive behavior without considering the context of Marcus's medical crisis. "Did you think it was appropriate to suspend a student for trying to save his diabetic brother's life?" David asked. "He was shouting and making threats," she replied. "We have to maintain order during emergencies." "What threat specifically did he make?" She consulted her notes. "He said he would sue the school district." "That's not a threat of violence. That's a statement of intent to seek legal remedies for negligence, correct?" Another long pause. I suppose so, yes. Everyone passed the buck, and nobody took responsibility for the fact that a child nearly died because they couldn't be bothered to make a phone call that they promised to make. Meanwhile, I was stuck serving my 3-day suspension while Marcus recovered from his hospitalization. The school board held a hearing to review the suspension and upheld it unanimously. Board member Patricia Wilson said that emergency procedures must be followed regardless of personal circumstances, and that making exceptions would set a dangerous precedent. "What if every student claimed a family emergency to get out of lockdown?" she asked during the public hearing. "We'd have chaos." The question showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what had happened. I hadn't tried to leave the lockdown. I'd simply asked for a welfare check for a diabetic child, which should have been a routine request. Jake Martinez and several other students who witnessed everything wrote detailed statements supporting my version of events. They confirmed that I'd been calm and respectful when initially asking for help, and only became upset after hours of being ignored while my brother's condition worsened. Emma Chen, the student council president, wrote a particularly compelling statement. "I was there when he first asked for help around 1 p.m. He was polite and explained his brother's medical condition clearly. The adults told him they would send someone to check, but then they didn't follow through. He only started yelling when he realized they had lied to him and his brother could be dying. Any decent person would have reacted the same way." But the school administration had already painted me as a disruptive student who'd created chaos during a dangerous situation. They claimed I'd been shouting and threatening people from the beginning, which was completely false, but fit their narrative better than admitting they'd failed to handle a simple medical emergency. The case dragged on for 8 months, during which time the school district spent over $150,000 in legal fees fighting us, instead of just admitting they'd made a mistake and improving their emergency procedures. They hired 3 different law firms and brought in expert witnesses to testify about lockdown protocols and student behavior management. During those months, I had to deal with the social fallout at school. About half the students supported me once they learned the full story, but the other half believed the administration's version of events. Some parents complained at school board meetings that I should have been expelled for disrupting emergency procedures and putting other students at risk. The teachers were split as well. Most of my regular teachers, who knew me as a good student, were supportive and understanding. But some of the administrators and staff treated me like a troublemaker who'd gotten away with something. Mr. Davidson, my chemistry teacher, was particularly supportive. "You did exactly what any responsible older brother would do," he told me after class one day. "The fact that they punished you for caring about your brother's life shows how backwards this system has become." But Mrs. Rodriguez, the counselor, would barely make eye contact with me in the hallways. She'd clearly decided I was a problem student who needed to be watched carefully. The breakthrough in our case came when David discovered that the Jefferson School District had received similar complaints about medical emergencies being ignored during lockdowns. He found records of 3 other incidents in the previous 2 years where students had reported family medical emergencies during lockdowns and been dismissed or ignored. In one case, a student had asked for help when her elderly grandfather with heart problems was experiencing chest pain at home. She'd been told that lockdown procedures didn't allow for outside contact, and her grandfather ended up having a heart attack and nearly dying before neighbors found him. In another incident, a student had reported that his younger sister with severe asthma was home alone during a lockdown, and her inhaler was empty. School officials had promised to call the parents, but never followed through. The girl ended up in the emergency room with a severe asthma attack that could have been prevented with a simple phone call. The pattern was clear. Jefferson School District prioritized rigid adherence to lockdown procedures over basic human compassion and common sense medical concerns. The smoking gun was a training memo that David uncovered during discovery. The memo, distributed to all staff the year before, explicitly instructed teachers and administrators not to accommodate individual requests during lockdowns, regardless of the circumstances. The memo stated that making exceptions would compromise the integrity of emergency procedures and could lead to procedural breakdown and potential safety violations. The memo had been written by the district's risk management consultant, a former police officer named Gary Mitchell, who specialized in school security. Mitchell had apparently decided that the best way to handle lockdowns was to treat them like military operations, where no exceptions could be made for any reason. When David deposed Mitchell, the consultant defended his memo by saying that lockdowns required military-style discipline and that emotional responses to individual circumstances could compromise the safety of the entire school population. So if a student reports that their diabetic sibling is home alone without insulin, the correct response is to ignore them? David asked. The correct response is to maintain lockdown integrity, Mitchell replied. Individual concerns must be subordinated to collective security. Even if that individual concern involves a child who could die without medication, emergency personnel can handle medical issues after the lockdown is resolved. But in this case, emergency personnel weren't called because your procedures prevented school staff from making that call. Mitchell had no good answer for that. Faced with this evidence, the district's legal team finally realized they were fighting a losing battle. The training memo showed institutional indifference to medical emergencies, and the pattern of similar incidents demonstrated that Marcus's case wasn't an isolated mistake, but part of a systematic problem. 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, the district agreed to settle out of court. The terms were significant. They paid all of Marcus's medical bills, which totaled nearly $25,000 for the ICU stay and ongoing monitoring equipment. They also established a $75,000 education fund for Marcus's college expenses. More importantly, from a systemic perspective, they agreed to completely revise their emergency protocols to include specific provisions for medical emergencies involving family members during lockdowns. They also agreed to provide annual training for all staff on recognizing and responding to medical emergencies. The settlement also required the district to expunge my suspension record completely and provide a written apology. The apology was crafted by lawyers and didn't really acknowledge the depth of their failures, but it was officially on record. The apology read, "The Jefferson School District acknowledges that our emergency procedures did not adequately address the medical emergency reported by the student regarding his diabetic brother. We have revised our protocols to ensure that similar situations are handled more appropriately in the future. We regret any distress caused to the student and his family during this incident." It was bland and bureaucratic, but it was something. More importantly, the changes they agreed to implement would hopefully prevent other families from going through what we'd experienced. The new procedures required immediate welfare checks when students report medical emergencies involving family members with documented conditions like diabetes, epilepsy, severe asthma, or other life-threatening conditions. Schools now had to maintain a database of students with siblings who had medical conditions requiring regular medication or monitoring. They also installed cell signal boosters in all designated lockdown areas so students could communicate with family members during emergencies. The old storage room where we'd been trapped now had full cell coverage and a landline phone specifically for emergency use. Most importantly, the new protocols clearly stated that medical emergencies take priority over lockdown containment procedures in situations involving nonviolent threats like bomb scares. The welfare of students' family members was no longer considered secondary to procedural compliance. The changes came too late to help Marcus and me, but they represented a victory for basic human decency over bureaucratic rigidity. Marcus made a full recovery and became much more proactive about managing his diabetes after the incident. The experience taught him that he couldn't always depend on other people to be looking out for him, which was a harsh lesson for a 12-year-old, but probably a valuable one in the long run. He now carries emergency supplies everywhere: glucose tablets, extra insulin, emergency glucagon injections, and a medical alert bracelet that explains his condition. He also has a continuous glucose monitor that sends alerts to both his phone and mine if his blood sugar goes dangerously high or low. The incident made him more independent and responsible about his health management, though I wish he hadn't had to learn those lessons through such a traumatic experience. Looking back 3 years later, what bothers me most isn't even the medical emergency itself. Kids with diabetes face potential crises regularly, and we dealt with blood sugar problems before. What destroyed my faith in authority was how the adults in charge handled the situation. They lied to a scared teenager about getting help, then punished me for caring about my brother's life more than their bureaucratic procedures. When I pointed out that they'd failed to follow through on their promise to send help, they made me the villain instead of accepting responsibility for their incompetence. It would have been so easy to admit the mistake, send someone to check on Marcus, and revise their procedures to prevent similar problems in the future. Instead, they chose to wage a legal war that cost taxpayers over $200,000 in legal fees and settlements, all because they couldn't admit that their lockdown procedures were dangerously inflexible. The worst part was listening to Principal Williams testify under oath that he'd acted appropriately given the information available when he hadn't even tried to get more information. When a student tells you their diabetic sibling needs immediate medical attention, your job is to help, not to dismiss them as an individual concern that doesn't matter during lockdowns. I graduated from Jefferson High with decent grades despite everything, but I never felt the same about authority figures after that experience. The people who were supposed to protect students had failed us in the most basic way possible, then tried to cover up their failure by destroying my reputation. The experience taught me that bureaucrats will always prioritize covering their mistakes over doing the right thing. When you're dealing with an emergency, don't trust anyone who says they'll handle it without giving you specific details about what they're actually going to do and when they'll do it. Marcus is now 15 and thriving. He's on the varsity soccer team despite his diabetes, maintains excellent control of his blood sugar, and has become an advocate for other kids with type 1 diabetes. He volunteers at diabetes summer camps and speaks at pediatric endocrinology conferences about the importance of emergency preparedness. He jokes that the incident taught him never to depend entirely on other people for his health, which is probably a good lesson, even if it came at such a terrible cost. He's incredibly mature about his condition now and has inspired several other diabetic kids at his current school to be more proactive about their care. Mom still gets angry when she talks about what happened. As a nurse, she understands better than most people how close Marcus came to dying and how easily the whole crisis could have been prevented with basic competence from the school officials. I should have pulled you both out of that school immediately, she says sometimes. I was too worried about disrupting your education, but I should have prioritized your safety over academic continuity. The $75,000 education fund has helped Marcus attend Summit Preparatory Academy, a private school where the staff actually knows about his diabetes and has detailed emergency procedures for handling medical situations. The smaller class sizes mean teachers can pay individual attention to students' needs, and the administration is responsive to parents' concerns rather than defensive. Marcus is planning to study pre-med in college and wants to specialize in pediatric endocrinology to help other kids with diabetes. The experience that nearly killed him ended up inspiring his career path and giving him a deeper understanding of how medical crises affect families. As for me, the whole ordeal taught me to be skeptical of people in authority who claim to be acting in everyone's best interest. Too often, they're just protecting themselves and their institutions, rather than actually helping the people they're supposed to serve. The lockdown procedures have been updated at schools across Oregon because of our case. Marcus's near-death experience led to statewide policy changes that give students the right to request welfare checks for family members with documented medical conditions during emergency lockdowns. Schools are now required to maintain databases of students whose family members have conditions like diabetes, epilepsy, severe asthma, or other conditions requiring regular medication. When lockdowns occur, these students automatically get priority for communication with home to ensure their family members are safe. It's a small victory, but it means other families won't have to watch their loved ones suffer because bureaucrats can't be bothered to make a phone call during a crisis. The case also led to better training for school staff about recognizing genuine medical emergencies versus typical teenage drama. Teachers now receive annual training on conditions like diabetes, epilepsy, and severe asthma, so they can distinguish between real crises and minor concerns. 3 years later, I still think about what could have happened if I had been just 30 minutes later getting home from school. Marcus could have slipped into a diabetic coma and died while I sat in that principal's office being lectured about my attitude and behavior. The adults who were supposed to protect students had failed so completely that a 12-year-old nearly paid with his life for their incompetence. That's not something you forget or forgive easily. That's why I'm sharing this story now. When authority figures tell you to trust the system during an emergency, remember that systems are run by people and people make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes can be fatal, especially when the people running the system care more about following procedures than saving lives. Don't let anyone tell you that following bureaucratic procedures is more important than protecting your family. And don't let them punish you for caring more about human life than their institutional convenience. If you have a family member with a medical condition like diabetes, make sure you have backup plans that don't depend on other people doing their jobs correctly. Have multiple emergency contacts, keep supplies in different locations, and make sure your family member knows how to handle crises independently when necessary. Because when things go wrong, you might be the only person who can save them. The authorities who promise to help might be too busy following procedures to actually provide the help they promise. Thanks for reading this far. Hug your siblings a little tighter tonight and make sure they know how to take care of themselves when you're not around. The world is full of people who will fail you when you need them most, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting for the people you love. Eat it. A lot of people have asked about the specific changes made to lockdown procedures after our settlement. Here's what schools in Oregon are now required to do. Medical emergency database. Schools must maintain a confidential database of students whose immediate family members have conditions requiring regular medication, diabetes, epilepsy, severe asthma, etc. Priority communication. During lockdowns, these students get priority access to phones or cell service to check on family members. Immediate welfare checks. If a student reports a medical emergency involving a family member during a lockdown, school officials must immediately contact emergency services for a welfare check. Verification requirements. Staff must confirm with dispatch that welfare checks are actually being conducted and get callback numbers for updates. Medical versus security priority. Medical emergencies involving life-threatening conditions take priority over lockdown containment procedures in non-violent threat situations. Communication equipment. All lockdown areas must have working cell coverage or landline phones for emergency communication. Staff training. Annual training for all staff on recognizing medical emergencies and understanding conditions like diabetes, epilepsy, and severe asthma. No retaliation. Students cannot be disciplined for advocating for family members' medical needs during emergencies. Eat it too. Several people have messaged me about similar experiences with schools ignoring medical emergencies. If this happened to you, document everything immediately while memories are fresh. Get statements from witnesses, other students, teachers who were sympathetic. Contact a lawyer who specializes in educational law or civil rights. File complaints with your state Department of Education. Don't let them convince you that following procedures justifies ignoring medical emergencies. Schools have a legal duty to act reasonably when students report genuine medical crises involving family members, even during lockdowns. The key is proving that they failed to meet that duty of care. Eat it 3. Medical info for parents of diabetic kids. If your child has type 1 diabetes, make sure they and their siblings know. Normal blood sugar range, 80 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. Signs of high blood sugar, extreme thirst, frequent urination, nausea, confusion. When to use emergency glucagon, blood sugar over 400 or if unconscious. Always call 911 for blood sugar over 400 or ketones in urine. Keep emergency supplies in multiple locations, school, home, car, backpack. Eat it 4. Update on Marcus. He just finished his sophomore year at Summit Prep with a 4.0 GPA and made varsity soccer as a diabetic athlete. He's been accepted into a summer research program at OHSU studying pediatric endocrinology. The kid who almost died from bureaucratic incompetence is now going to become the doctor who helps other diabetic children. Final edit. This post has gotten way more attention than I expected. To everyone sharing their own stories of institutional failure in the comments, I see you and I believe you. Whether it's schools ignoring medical emergencies, hospitals dismissing patient concerns, or government agencies failing to help when lives are at stake, the pattern is always the same. Bureaucrats protecting themselves instead of serving the people they're supposed to help. The only way things change is when we hold them accountable and refuse to accept we were just following procedures as an excuse for failing to do what's right. Keep fighting for yourselves and your families. Sometimes you really are the only person who can save them.